I don't have emotional capacity for this.
That's really just saying, I'm feeling quite self-absorbed.
This is me.
That's close to the idea of you must love me as I am.
Referring to other people as red flags and icks.
This red flag mania can get out of control, because if you really have to exclude from your life everyone who's got a red flag, on the one hand, you'll be very safe. On the other hand, you'll be completely alone.
Alain, it's lovely to have you on Spectator TV. You recently told me that you became a psychotherapist, and that led me to think about, in London, you can't really walk a few meters without being reminded to think about your mental health. Do you need a psychotherapist? And I wondered, from your experience so far of this new role, what makes a good psychotherapist?
First of all, it's important to say there are many bad psychotherapists, and many people will say things like, I tried psychotherapy and I didn't like it. And my answer is always, you tried a psychotherapist and you didn't like them. It's like picking up a book in Waterstones and not getting on well with it and then deciding you don't like literature. It really is a very particular thing. And the training to become a psychotherapist is alarmingly, what can we say, imaginative, creative. It doesn't really, it doesn't knock people into shape in the way that a pilot training course or a legal training course would do. There's still a lot of room for individual initiative, for better and for worse. And so, look, broadly speaking, what is a psychotherapist doing for you? There's somebody who's going to help you to think better about, your options and your life. And it sounds quite weird, because why can't we think on our own? And I think our minds get stuck. We literally sort of run into the sands. And a good psychotherapist sort of teases out bits of you that are kind of lying in the semi-conscious darkness and helps you to know yourself better than you knew when you were on your own. That's really the function of a psychotherapist.
And a lot more psychotherapy is done on Zoom these days rather than in person. And how important do you think is it to have that down the line interaction versus face-to-face?
I'm a fan of I'm a fan of Zoom. I think it's so convenient. I'm also a fan, incidentally, of artificial intelligence in this area, which I think is going to make enormous strides and enormous differences. A lot of people, anecdotally, are already starting to use AI as their therapist. They will describe their problems to the therapist, and the problem is that it's a bit of a people pleaser, AI, in its current form. It says, that's terrific, etc. It doesn't do what a good psychotherapist should do, which is it points to challenge you. And sometimes people say, my friend had therapy and all they did was to become a more nightmarish version of themselves. I think that's often the case when the therapist isn't brave or bold or deft enough to come in with an interesting challenge to somebody's worldview. So I think good therapy shouldn't just be validating everything you say. They should also at points be sort of helping you to grow towards something a little bit.
So there is sometimes a moment where you have to say, actually, I think your opinion or what you're doing is potentially wrong or potentially more damaging, and you might want to reconsider.
Never in that tone, because if you did that, they would be running out. One of the things that psychotherapy teaches you is a massive enemy of insight is defensiveness. And what you've always got to do is to steer around people's defenses. And, as we know from sort of HR feedback, etc., if you want to try and get a criticism across to somebody or a negative or a difficult truth, you have to do it so carefully. Otherwise, people shut down. And it's not just in psychotherapy, in all areas of human interaction. But psychotherapy has got lots of techniques to help people to assume that their thought is totally their own. Actually, the psychotherapist is very often one step ahead, is trying to prepare the grounds for that thought to hatch.
Have you come across Abigail Schreier? She's written a book called Bad Therapy.
Oh, yes.
See, a lot of people talk about it, and she says that her argument is that we've become too obsessed with talking about our emotions. We tend to ruminate on issues, and we constantly want to explore this idea of thinking about your feelings, and actually that makes things so much worse. And I always wonder, how do you find the balance between, yes, communicating that something is upsetting you, or actually just having the attitude of, I'm not going to face this emotion. Probably a slightly more old school attitude. People in the Second World War, they still now don't talk, well, many of them are dead, but they won't talk about what happened to them. And that's just their way of dealing with their grief. And actually we've seen that mental health has got worse And is that a correlation that more people are talking about it?
I mean, look, I've got immense sympathy for what you might call the Stoic worldview, which is to say that the exploration of emotions doesn't merely resolve emotional problems; it creates them. And I think that our complexity as human beings is frankly annoying. Why are we so strange and complicated? Why can't we just get on with it? And I really, really sympathise with that impatience. I mean, take the idea that your childhood should have a huge and determining effect on the rest of your life. It's such a boring idea. I mean, the idea that what happened to you before you were 10 is going to shape the next 8 decades. I mean, whoever wanted this? However, it may be true. And this is the point. This is the boring thing. Just because it's inconvenient doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. It's like a glass of water. When microbiology got going in the end of the 19th century, people were astonished to think that in an average glass of water, you could have enough toxins to poison an entire city's water supply. It just seemed, there's nothing in this glass. Why would there be something? If you can't see it, it's not there. And sometimes we approach psychological problems with some of that robust impatience, which in some areas of life is really helpful. We sort of minimize how complicated things can possibly be, and we will ourselves to be simpler than we in fact are. And though, as I say, I have a lot of sympathy for that view, it tends to backfire in the long term. So that shoving things behind the sofa, while it's a good short-term strategy, and may at times be necessary, especially in a world war, long-term is going to come back and bite you. And so, on the whole, better in than out, out than in. Sorry, reversal, Freudian slip there. Better out than in, and with lots of caveats and lots of apology for how complicated it is. I mean, take couples who are advised nowadays to really think long and hard about what's going on between them, to have open channels of communication, to reveal their small hurts, etc. You think, wasn't it better in the olden days? And the answer is, no, it wasn't really. So I think we've got no alternative, but I'm very sympathetic to any members of the audience who might be thinking, oh, surely there's a simpler way of doing it. I know the impatience. One just wants it to be easy, but it's not. And our mighty brains that have produced extraordinary things like, the space shuttle or Wagner's operas or, Proust's novels. We've all got these brains, whether we were able to get that sort of output, some glorious output out of them. We're all carrying these incredibly complex minds, and they do just emit all kinds of static and problematic dimensions, which we need to be ready for.
How do you find personally, having worked in this area for decades, having so many people ask you about their problems and needing to have such eloquent answers every single time? It must be a huge burden for you.
It's not a burden. I always, I take myself as my first patient, client, etc. The work that I do is very intuitive. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. There's a lot of people not far from this building who will be wiring people up and putting electrodes in their brains, etc., to try and get data. As I say, I proceed by intuition. I'm, a creative writer first and foremost, and I think that some people say to me things like, "How did you know that about me?" And I go, "Well, obviously I didn't. I'm just taking myself as a sounding board. And if it's true, feels true for me, it may feel true for you." This is always the way that artists have kind of proceeded, and it's a shortcut, but it isn't verifiable. And so, if you look at the output of psychologists. I sometimes glance at psychological academic papers, and my goodness, they're boring, because they'll say things like, is there a correlation between an increased heartbeat and falling in love? And they'll study this for sort of 22 years, and they'll go, yes, there is. And at the end of their research, and you think, I kind of knew that. We all knew that already. But science has to proceed by this, criteria of verifiability, which is what makes psychology, the sort of scientific branch of, the study of the human animal, tantalizingly boring very often. And if you've read books by psychologists, they often think, this is common sense. And the point is, it's true, but they have to go and check it to make absolutely certain that it really is a bit more than common sense. So.
They say an old phrase is that you shouldn't, I think it's at dinner parties, you shouldn't talk about politics, religion. And is there a third one?
affairs, of your recent divorce.
That sounds like it should be off the table.
I mean, I tend to head there immediately.
Well, I was about to say,
Yeah.
I am going straight to politics to start off with.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask your advice on behalf of our viewers who are very political and often you'd call them contrarians. How might you have a healthy political conversation with someone who you completely disagree with?
I think the thing to do is to drop beneath the level of politics, to try and understand why people believe what they believe at an emotional level. And I think that that's one of the most fascinating and under-discussed things about people's political views, is they are not founded simply on rational means. People don't look around, evaluate the evidence, and pull together a thesis as to why they believe what they believe. They're drawn to it for reasons that often they can't quite understand. And fear has a lot to do with it. And I think one interesting question is to go, of a political attitude that you don't approve of, what are you afraid of here? And if people are honest and it's late at night and, the defences are a bit lower, you'll get some fascinating arguments. What is a supporter of Brexit or an enemy of Brexit? Try and turn that into a person. What do they look like? How do they relate to you? What bit of you are they unsympathetic towards or sympathetic towards? And often you get led into people's biographies quite quickly. And people will say, I adopted this political view because it's a defence against my father who had a depressing attitude that I'm in flight from. Or someone will go, this political view draws me closer to my mother, with whom it's very important to feel a sense of loyalty. So that view draws me towards her. And so quite quickly, you're no longer talking about politics, you're talking about psychology. And I think too often we try to persuade ourselves and persuade others of political views without acknowledging the far more important psychological bedrock on which those views are resting.
A lot of studies have been done that typically conservatives are happier than people, they say liberals or people from the left. And originally the response would be, well, often that's circumstantial. They might be from a higher socioeconomic background. Of course, they'll be happier. But actually, other studies have found that it's to do with personality characteristics, and neuroticism would score very highly from people on the left. Do you think that's part of the problem as well, that often when you end up having a political clash with someone, it might not necessarily be politics, it could be any other topic, but your personality is typically just aren't aligned? That's
right. And so you're not really talking about the thing that you're actually talking about.
Yeah.
So that beneath the political struggle, there is a struggle of two worldviews that are not matching, but a worldview at a kind of psychological level. And a lot of it, when we discuss a word like meritocracy, where people stand on a word like meritocracy, goes way deeper than merely politics. The notion that we should be making our societies more meritocratic and what that means quite is very linked up to a sense of agency and also where sympathy is deserved and allocated. So, the notion that everybody's had a fair start, and therefore where people end up, what happens in their life, is their responsibility. That's a view that one associates with the right, and that's a view that's very connected up with the notion of high levels of autonomy and responsibility. And if you believe in that, you'll be extremely threatening to someone who might be feeling that what's happened in their life is the result of wider forces, etc. So you can get into struggles that look political but are in fact inherently psychological. And there's a lack of compassion both ways, in that people are not really acknowledging what they're afraid of. And a really important way of cutting through arguments with a smile is to say, what's the thing you're afraid of here? I can hear you arguing passionately, and I know you're advocating a point of view, but what's the fear? Put it into a person. If this argument were a person, how would they be frightening you?
Have your views or attitudes or approaches to giving advice, the school of life, has it changed throughout your life? Because you've been doing this for decades now. And has it moved with the world, which has moved a great deal? Or have you hardened? Or have you become more empathetic to younger people?
Yes. I mean, look, I think that I've grown more aware of the perversity of human nature and the perplexity. I think when you look at people's lives, it is extraordinary how people manage that some areas go well in everybody's life and then other areas are incredibly complicated for reasons that you can't quite understand. If you look at the political sphere, politics is all about increasing opportunities for people. But when you drop down from the political level to the personal level and you see how people are managing their opportunities, there is, as I say, the word perversity comes to mind. Why is someone always getting in relationships that fail? Why are they in their 6th relationship and it's failed? What's going on there? Why has someone had ostensibly lots of chances to do something marvelous, and yet somehow they're always to the right or to the left of where the main opportunity lies? And you can't really answer these questions in common sense terms. You have to start to look at, if you like, the kind of hidden scripts that many of us are carrying. And these scripts will tell people very paradoxical things, like, if you succeed, you'll be in danger of losing my love. It's a message that might have come through from a parental source. Or someone might have a script that says, you can succeed, but you must be miserable. That's the equation. You can have everything material, but you'll have nothing psychological or whatever. And it takes a very long time for people to detect what the paradox is. I mean, people might not get it throughout their life, but a lot of this comes through intergenerationally. So parents will be sending messages to their children that are really strange, like, I love you and I want to be happy, but if you succeed, please don't threaten me. Or please be happy, but not as happy, never any happier than I've managed to be. Or go forth and spread your wings, but don't abandon me. And these kind of messages help to explain how people can find themselves tied in invisible knots, not knowing what's gone wrong. Classic one is around relationships. We think that the world is made up of people who desperately long for love. And with one hand or one eye, that is what people seem to be after. But we can't ignore that with another hand, another eye, people are just as keen to escape the possibilities of actually encountering a functioning, loving relationship. Because, why? It's very frightening. And if your earliest experience of relationships has been one where vulnerability got you into trouble, where being close to people became equated with suffering, when in adulthood possibility of closeness reemerges, one side of you is happy and the other side of you is would like to do anything other than make something succeed. So we're really talking here about that odd phrase, self-sabotage.
Yeah.
And it operates across personal life, across work life, etc. But you can only really understand self-sabotage by understanding that people's minds are multiple, that there are layers of consciousness, some more conscious, some less conscious, and that people are, have got multiple goals, some of which are clashing. And this is what makes us human beings just devilishly hard to make sense of.
And you write a lot in your books about how you mustn't underplay the significance of what happens in your childhood. And is that things that could happen that you don't necessarily remember, but they can have trauma on you that feeds then into your later life?
Sure. And again, this is very strange. And I used the word before, insulting to our modern adult intelligence. You sort of think, really, what happened to me when I was 5? I sometimes think one way for people to try and understand it is to think about language, how we acquired language. None of us, I think, remembers how we learned to speak. But we did, because that's what we're doing now. And we speak with a very distinct accent, and an accent that bears heavy traces of the context in which we learned to speak. So without understanding that this is what we were doing while we were drawing buttercups in the kitchen table, doing handstands in the garden, etc., we were acquiring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words and grammatical declensions and grammatical rules, and we remember absolutely nothing of it. But this is why nowadays we identify as an English speaker, a Finnish speaker, a Korean speaker. And if you want to change the language in which you speak, you have to go back to school, and it's unbelievably hard. So there are all sorts of things that we know intuitively that escape our conscious grasp. And if we want to try and unpick some of the, because one of the things that happens in childhood is that we learn wonky grammar. We, psychotherapists talk of projections that come from childhood. And one way to think about it is we're massively generalizing creatures. We generalize from the specific and we move outwards. So depending on what happened to you in your childhood, you will come away with generalizations like, men in authority are really nice. You can trust men in authority. They've got the best interests at heart for you, and you should work for them and help them. That would be one moral that you gain from a father and a teacher. Other people might come away thinking, the thing about women is you can never trust them. Or the thing about women is they're marvelous. Or the thing about children is they'll always bring you down. Or the thing about community is you'll never belong. Whatever. So we learn all these extrapolations from specific examples, specific mothers, fathers, siblings, etc. will create these global conclusions. And we often don't even know we're wandering through the world with them. And it can take a very long time. And it's often only when we find ourselves in an adult relationship, one-on-one, that someone will go, it's strange how every time I try and reassure you, you think I'm trying to undermine you. And the person goes, but you are trying to undermine me. And the person goes, no, I'm not. I think you'll find I'm not. But the legacy of having been undermined, let's say, in childhood, has led to a generalization which the person isn't even conscious of. So psychologists and psychotherapists one of the ways to look at what they're up to is to try and unpick these projections, try and rein them in so as to give people a more accurate view of reality. That old phrase, fears are not facts. Well, it's not just fears that are not facts. It's loves are not facts. Assumptions are not facts. And we need to kind of reality check them. So we emerge into the adult world full of really fragile and contestable conclusions on things without understanding that this is what's going on. And one of the good things about being in therapy should be that the therapist is a relatively neutral person. And what will tend to happen is that at some point in the therapy, the client will start to behave in ways that owe much more to the past than the present. So they'll say things like, I know that you're finding me boring. And the therapist genuinely says, no, I don't think so. But the person is absolutely convinced that they're boring. Or someone will go, I know you find me disgusting. I know you think that I'm sexually weird. And the therapist will go, and there's nothing no, I genuinely don't. But the person will be carrying something. And that's a really helpful moment because that's a chance to unpick a legacy of the past, a kind of distortion of the past that's getting in the way of fruitful adult relationships.
Before you arrived, I did an interview with our editor, Michael Gove, and we were sat in slightly different chairs to the ones we're sat in now because we maybe it's ridiculous on Spectator TV, but we wanted to give a different vibe. With our big chairs, we've got political conversations, news, and now I kind of think and feel like I'm in a therapy session. So I'm going to lean into that and ask for some therapist advice. I think anyone that knows me would know that I am an extrovert. And I think I did a test once that said I was a 98% extrovert. So I'm high scoring on the extroversion scale. And I think one of the questions one might ask an extrovert is, how do you find being alone? And I never feel the need to be on my own. I probably don't mind it, I would argue. But whenever I'm alone, I will play podcast, I'll play radio, I'll have sounds, I'll call people. There's very few occasions where I'm in complete silence and stillness. How bad do you think that is?
I'm sensing in the question, let's try this, that maybe you're slightly in two minds. Maybe one part of you, is happy being the way you are. Another part of you maybe is curious, wondering, why am I like this? Is there something, dare I say, that I might be missing out on? Is there something that, I'm not merely choosing, but might also be running from, maybe? And I think these are really fruitful inquiries and they're signs of a very open mind. And I think that silence and emptiness is worrying for us because very often we're in flight from something that's a bit tricky. And the great thing about activity is that we're in control. But, a useful question to ask therapeutically is to say to someone, if you weren't able to think about that thing that's obsessing you all the time, what might you need to think about? What's the thought behind the thought? What's the thought behind the chatter? What's the thought that silence might allow through? And very often it's things like, well, I might need to be sad, which is something that none of us really wants to head into. But many sad things happen every day. And, many of us are the fruit of childhoods where maybe there wasn't much time or much psychological space for sadness. And therefore we learned a lesson that if you stop and are sad, you get into danger. You can't afford that. And so that's the sort of assumption that we've made. And it might mean that we then need to keep running quite a lot. And if there is the threat of a silence, we might need to shut that down. Or, a silence might allow us to realize a dissatisfaction, an area of trouble that is challenging to us. We might realize maybe I'm in the wrong job, or perhaps my relationship, which I tell myself day to day is fine, is actually not fine. And as I say, silence can allow these things to break through, which is why it is important to give yourself room for that, just to check in with these other sides of the mind that may be holding quite important truths. I mean, one of the things that people tend to find is that, there are methods of communication which different parts of their bodies and minds are trying to articulate, which we may be ignoring. So, for example, someone may have a lingering sense that they are not in the right job, and the job that they're in is causing them a lot of anxiety and stress, but they have no time for it. And it builds and builds and builds until one morning they get up and their back just doesn't move. Their back is clenched tight and they can't get out of bed and they're in real trouble. And it's not merely a physical problem at that point. We may need to think, well, what's the back become a repository for? What's it trying to say? If your back could speak, what might it be trying to tell you? And if we're not listening to what bits of our conscious minds are trying to tell us, then it gets driven either into the unconscious or indeed into the bodily. So one of the ways of reading a lot of bodily symptoms, particularly around backs, but also digestive issues, also things like sleep issues, is that there are attempts to say things that we've not given time to listen to.
Maybe I'll try it at some point.
I sense your hesitation. And by the way, I'm hugely sympathetic. It's very frightening. And too often there's a slightly sort of harsh view of, you can't do a solitary meditation 24 hours. What's wrong with you? It's deeply frightening. And you need to, make friends with that part of your mind that might be thinking, I'm not sure this is, not sure what might emerge. And tell yourself, well, whatever it is, let's bear with it and go slowly with it.
The other topic that is typically off table at dinner parties is religion. And some of your teachings have been, I don't want to, you can explain it yourself, but have been that you're an atheist, but you've seen ways in which atheists can grasp some teachings from religion and apply it to your life in a way that's good. And I don't know if you've come across the acronym WEIRD.
I haven't.
Joe Hendrick, he's a Harvard anthropologist, have described the West as Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Weird, and has basically implied he doesn't have an opinion. He doesn't have an opinion whether it's good or bad, but this is a whole new experience that humanity has had, where religion is completely removed from their lives. Even pre-Christians had some sort of an enchantment to them, and I wondered how you've found your argument with taking some of the lessons that you can get from religion, but isn't it slightly a bit of an empty vessel if you don't carry with it that deep belief or spirituality? Because will it really make it much of a difference?
I mean, look, I think we are still among the first generations to be trying to cope with life outside of a religious structure. And many of the problems that human beings have been getting themselves into of late can be read as byproducts or accidental side effects of trying to live a secular life. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm a secular person. It is possible to have a good enough secular life. But there are challenges. And I think that we too quickly have moved from the idea God doesn't exist to that's the end of the story. That we can now lead godless lives without any problem. And, when Nietzsche in the mid-19th century, or towards the end of the 19th century, made that famous declaration, God is dead, he didn't suggest this triumphantly. He very presciently saw that humanity would have enormous trouble steering through a godless world, an apparently godless world. And so that's what has been sort of fired my thinking about religion. And I've really been interested in looking at what religions have offered people and what might still be available to people. And it's things like a sense of awe. One of the wonderful things about a religious worldview is that it relativizes human achievement. It places human beings within a context where the divine looms much, much larger. So in coronation ceremonies, traditionally, a king or monarch would bow down to the divine. However much power they had in the earthly realm, they were still as nothing in the godly realm, and that's hugely salutary. When you think about the amount of trouble that comes to human beings from their egos butting up against the limitations of every individual ego in a world of 8 billion people, we're constantly feeling, as it were, too small, not important enough, and this kind of psychological injury, narcissistic injury, if you like, pursues us through life. People essentially are constantly getting bruised and feeling, I'm not important enough. You go to a hotel and the person doesn't recognize you or gives you a bad room and you think, I'm not, my true importance hasn't been fathomed. The wonderful thing about religion is it says, look, we're all as nothing in the context of something so much older, deeper, grander than anything human will ever manage to be. But I think that there's a version of this that can survive even outside a strictly religious worldview. And the sight of the stars at night, the age of the world, the multiplicity of mass extinctions, etc., help to relativize the here and now. We live very pressed up against the present. This is what journalism does, bless it. This is what the media does. It constantly gives a sense that now matters so much. And it's very, very hard to achieve mental peace. And, we talk about an epidemic of mental illness, etc. And people will anecdotally say things like, nature helps me. It's nice to look at trees, or I've got a dog and the dog, helps to ground me. These are all ways in which we're being taken out of the human realm, out of the here and now, given a larger canvas to measure ourselves against. And this has an enormously consoling and soothing effect, because ultimately what we're looking to do is not to try and be bigger, but to try and be smaller in a reconciled way against a sort of majestic backdrop. And this is what the modern world is very bad at providing us with opportunities for.
Final part of the interview, I asked a few people in the office what they thought I should ask you when we came in, and we ended up talking about mental health dogma. I want to fire at you some of the tropes that our colleagues hate the most when it comes to mental health. Yeah. And I wanted to see if you have any to add, or which ones you think are probably the most toxic.
Yeah.
I think even using the word toxic is toxic.
Yes, toxic is toxic. Yeah.
Bring your whole self to work.
Bring yourself to work. Your whole self to work is a denial of the fundamental division between the private and the public. It's an attempt to erase that division, and lots of good things happen through that division. The private matters because it isn't public, and the public, sometimes there's a real reason why you want to shut the door on home life on a Monday morning and go into a realm where you can be a simpler version of yourself, not the whole of yourself. It's actually a freedom. Sometimes we think, the whole of my humanity is being denied in this context, therefore I suffer. Sometimes it's wonderful. This is what we get in small talk. When someone goes, how was your weekend? And you go, it's terrific. The truth is, you were lying sobbing on the bathroom floor, wondering what it was all about. You briefly contemplated suicide, but you keep on going. You don't want to bring that up. And there's a freedom in saying, it was great. How was your weekend? This isn't just denial. This is an attempt to willingly simplify some of the complexities that are a burden to you as much as they can be to another person.
The next one, I don't have emotional capacity for this.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. You can. You can take it on board. That's really just saying, I'm feeling quite self-absorbed, and I want to dignify my self-absorption and my rejection of your problem through, an appeal to my own sensitivity. So make an effort. Be kind.
This one's for Oscar, who's filming this interview. People who are competitively busy.
competitively busy. I mean, look, of course we all want to be busy, and there's something shameful in the idea. I mean, you asked me, if I could come in to do this interview, and the truth is I had nothing else to do today. So you're the highlight of my day. I do have things to do, but look, I think the great fear is that we're not needed, and we often don't ask people for things because we think, oh, I'm going to be bothering this person. It's very nice to be bothered by people. So, advice to your listeners, if there's a question or something that you can ask someone, if you bring a dilemma to somebody, people love trying to solve other people's problems. This isn't a burden. This helps to anchor them in a sense of their own importance, which we're all in need of.
Last two. This is me.
That's close to the idea of you must love me as I am, which I've got a real problem.
Oh, you have a problem with that
No
one?
one should be loved as they are. Love me as I am. It's a battle cry of the sort of, people will say, I was in a relationship and, my partner, they just didn't love me as I am. And you think, good for the partner. I mean, obviously there's terrible ways of not loving someone for who they are. But all of us should aim to be loved, not just for who we are right now, but for who we aspire to be, our better selves. And that isn't cruelty. It's actually helping to back someone's better impulses.
And then referring to other people as red flags and icks.
Red flags. Look, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there are dangerous things about people, but this red flag mania can get out of control, because if you really have to exclude from your life everyone who's got a red flag, on the one hand, you'll be very safe. On the other hand, you'll be completely alone. So in Antarctica, there are no red flags, but you're very, very alone. So part of the messiness of human existence, and again, come back to religion, the great thing about Christianity is it says, we're living in a fallen world, but this is the world we live in. So everyone that we come across is, a sinner. We can argue about the language, rather heavy language, but put it into modern psychological language. Everybody's got issues. Everybody's got problems. Everybody's got something broken inside them. And so the notion that you should expunge anyone who's showing a flaw, as I say, good luck to you. And those people on Instagram, they're often very beautiful, Californian, about 24 years old, and they say things like, I got rid of this person and that person and the other person. You want to go, look, good for you. It's great. But after you reach, when you become a proper grown up, you'll realize that if you're really, shooting everybody who's got any single flaw, good for you, but you will be very, very alone.
My housemate won't forgive me if I don't ask this quickly, Alain. How do you write?
How do I write? I used to write by forcing myself to write and saying, I've got to write this thing. Now I write by asking myself a slightly weird question, which is, what do I really want to say? And so I access a slightly less conscious part of me, often in the early morning, when I just wake up and I think, right, what's on my mind? And there will be something. And the writing that comes from that side of the mind is likely to be superior to the kind that's, done when an editor says, I like 500 words on so-and-so. So, if you let the mind talk about what it wants to talk about, you'll be getting onto something richer. That's how I write.
Alain de Botton, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV.